The land was waiting to die. Under a low gray sky, the grass had turned the color of old bone. On the road out of Delwood, a buckboard creaked south, the horses thin from too many seasons of asking and not receiving. The woman on the Chel's scat tight against her side, thumb locked over the broken clasp. She had read the letter 3 times on the post office steps. She was still looking for what it had not said. From the north bank, a rider pulled up. He studied the wagon. Studied her, she Apache? 4 seconds of stillness. The driver did not slow, did not answer. The wheels turned. The wagon kept moving toward whatever waited at the end of the road. The question stayed with them. It rode the rest of the way in silence, heavier than the dust, older than the dry grass, and the land ahead seemed to be holding its breath. The letter came on a Tuesday, late October. The sky sat low over Delwood like something heavy had pressed it down and forgotten to lift it back up. Gray, colorless, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything. Kiona read it twice on the steps of the post office. Then she read it a 3rd time. Not because she hadn't understood it, because she was looking for the thing between the words. The thing careful men hid there when they didn't want to show their hand too early. The letter was short. A man named Garrett Aldous. A cattle operation 9 miles outside of town. He needed someone who could cook and keep a house and wasn't afraid of hard work. Room and board until things were sorted. If it suited them both, they could speak to the Reverend before winter. If it suited them both, she folded it along its original creases. Pressed the fold with her thumb. Put it in her coat pocket. Around her, Delwood went about its morning like she wasn't there. Which was fine. That was exactly how she needed it. She had arrived 6 days earlier. Last train. Evening. 1 canvas bag. 1 sewing basket with a broken clasp she held shut with her thumb whenever she lifted it. She had taken a room at the boarding house on the north end of the main street. The one run by a woman named Holt, who had asked 3 questions, received 3 short answers and decided that was sufficient. Kiona had spent those 6 days watching. Not because she was afraid, because she was thorough. She watched which men tipped their hats and which didn't. Which women crossed the street before they reached her and which ones just looked through her like she was glass. She watched who came in and out of the feed store, who lingered at the post office, who sat outside the saloon at noon, and who sat there at 3 in the afternoon, which told you something different entirely. She had been doing this her whole life. Reading a place before walking into it. Her mother had called it survival. Her grandmother had called it intelligence. The white women at the rooming house in Abilene had called it being very quiet. All 3 of them were right. She had answered Garrett Aldis's advertisement 3 weeks ago. From Abilene, where she had been taking in mending since April, where she had read every document she could find in the public reading room, land law, territory acts, cattle regulations, water rights, not because anyone had told her to, because she understood at 31. That knowledge was the one currency she could accumulate without anyone trying to take it from her the moment they saw her face. She was 31 years old. She had buried a husband in 1872, a child the year after. She had spent the 4 years since becoming very precise about what she needed and very quiet about what she wanted, which was not the same thing. Not even close. The advertisement had been plain, honest, even. A man who chose his words the way you chose tools, taking only what you needed, putting back what you didn't. Nothing ornamental, nothing warm. She had written back in the same register, no ornament, no warmth. She had received his reply. And now she was standing on the steps of the Delwood post office on a Tuesday in late coat pocket with a letter. In her coat pocket, and a broken clasp on her sewing basket, and a boarding house room she needed to vacate by the end of the week. So, she looked down toward the livery at the end of the main street. There was a man there standing beside a buckboard. His hand was flat against the neck of one of the horses, moving in slow circles, the patient kind. The kind that said the animal had been pushed past something and needed to be reminded it was safe. Kiona recognized that gesture before she recognized anything else about him. She started walking. She slowed before she reached him. Not from hesitation, never hesitation. From habit. She read the buckboard first, old, but not neglected. The boards replaced in sections, different wood tones lined up side by side. Repairs made when they mattered, not all at once. Someone who couldn't fix everything but fixed what needed fixing when it needed it. The horses were thin, not starving, not mistreated. Thin in the way that said the land had been asking more than it was giving back. She knew that look. She'd seen it on people. He turned, not quickly. Just completed the motion and let his hand fall. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been expecting, but hadn't let yourself picture too clearly. Dark eyes. A jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. 35 or 40. The sun made those years hard to count, and men who worked outside through every season without thinking about it. Aged in a way the sun made difficult to measure accurately. He said, "Are you the one who answered the advertisement?" Flat. The tone of a man stating something he's fairly sure of, and giving the other person room to correct if necessary. She said, "I am." He looked at her. Not the way men in new towns sometimes looked at her, assessing what they could make of her situation, calculating what her circumstances meant for them. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the horse, with attention that wanted information, not advantage. She let him look. He said, "There's a room off the kitchen. Window faces east. You'd have the mornings." And she thought, that's a strange thing to lead with, the mornings. Not the wage, not the distance, not the list of tasks, the mornings. She filed it, she said. "Tell me about the work," he said. "The herd is not what it was. Land wants more water than it's been getting. I've got one hand who's been with me 4 years. He does the work of 2 men. But there are things he can't manage. And things I can't manage either," she said. "What kind of things?" "Books are a disaster. Calves need watching at night in cold weather. Someone who knows what they're doing with a sick animal means the difference between losing it and not," she said. "I grew up in the Dragoon Mountains. My family kept horses, sheep on the lower grass." He went quiet. She could see him recalibrating something. She said, "Sheep aren't cattle," he said, slowly. "No," she said, "but sick is sick." He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the reins and said, "It's about 2 hours out." She climbed up onto the bench without waiting. The road ran south, then bent east toward open country. She didn't talk. Neither did he. She watched the land instead. The grass had come in pale and thin, a color that should have been green and wasn't quite, like something had tried to grow and almost made it. The sky was wide and flat and the color of old tin. No clouds moving in it anywhere. She was already understanding something about the water problem. Before he said a word, the land was telling you, plainly, if you knew how to read it. Her grandmother had pressed her hands into the ground every morning. Not to pray, though it looked like that if you didn't know, but to listen, to ask what the land needed, to have the conversation. The Chiricahua didn't see land the way the men with the survey maps saw it. Not something to be owned, not something to be divided, something to be in conversation with. You paid attention. The land spoke plainly. Most people just didn't speak the language. Kiona spoke it. She had learned other languages since. English, the language of legal documents. The language of a boarding house, where you paid your rents in Abilene, where you paid your rent on time and answered questions with short answers and were never anything other than precisely what the situation required you to be. She was fluent in all of them. But this one, the language the land spoke, that was the first one. The one underneath all the others. They were 40 minutes out of Delwood when it happened. A rider came along the north bank of a creek crossing. A man she'd seen outside the feed store. He pulled his horse up short and looked at the buckboard. Looked at Garrett, looked at her. Long enough that it wasn't accidental. He said, "Cole. That your new housekeeper?" And Kiona thought, "Cole." He said, "Cole." The advertisement said Aldous. But she kept that where it belonged. Filed it. Later, Garrett said, "That's right," the man said. "She Apache?" 4 seconds. She didn't move. Didn't look at the man. Didn't look at Garrett. She kept her eyes on the water, moving under the crossing and her thumb against the clasp of the sewing basket, and she was perfectly still. Garrett said. "She answered the advertisement same as anyone would," the man said. "That's not what I asked," Garrett said. "Then I guess I didn't answer." He picked up the reins, the horses moved. The man on the north bank said something else. She heard the tone of it, not the words, and Garrett did not slow, did not look back, did not say anything to her. For a long time after, neither of them spoke. Then Garrett said, "You should have told me," she said. "Your advertisement said you needed someone who could cook and keep a house and wasn't afraid of hard work." "I can do all three," he said. "That's not," she said. I know what that's not." She let that sit. She said, "You want to turn back? Turn back. I'll find the train." He didn't answer. He didn't turn back either. She noted that. The way she noted most things, quietly, without storing it as evidence of anything larger than it was. He kept driving. That was a fact. What it meant was something she wasn't ready to decide yet. The road got harder after that. Drier. Rutted from a rain that had come too late to matter and then left. She let her body learn the sway of the wagon rather than fighting it. She had ridden enough bad roads to know that. Bracing cost you more than surrendering to the rhythm did. He didn't speak. For the next hour, she didn't fill the silence. She watched the land. Thought about what she'd seen at the creek crossing. Thought about the man on the north bank and the particular quality of the question he'd asked. The flatness of it. The way he'd aimed it not at her, but at Garrett. Like she wasn't there to be addressed, only to be categorized. She had been categorized her whole, Apache. Like that was the whole of it. Like it was a closed sentence. She thought about the advertisement. About the man who'd written it. The plain words. Nothing ornamental. And now she thought, maybe there's a reason a man like that placed an advertisement in the first place. Maybe there's a reason he didn't ask about background in the letter. Maybe there are things he understands that the man on the north bank doesn't. Or maybe he just needed a housekeeper and hadn't thought it through. She would find out which one it was. She was good at finding things out. The ranch came into view from the top of a low rise. She saw it before he pointed it out. A house, a barn, 3 outbuildings. A corral with maybe 40 head moving slow in the afternoon light. The fence was substantial. Built by someone who knew what they were doing, or who had learned fast enough that it didn't matter. But the corral was too large for what was in it. Someone had built that fence expecting a larger life than the one currently inside it. He pulled up at the top of the rise. For a moment they both just looked at it. The way you look at something when you want to see it from the outside before you go back in. She didn't know if that was his habit, or if he was seeing it through her eyes and feeling something about what it looked like now, from up here with a stranger beside him. She said, "The frame's still good." He looked at her. She said, "Barn's solid. House is level. You've got water somewhere, or you wouldn't still be here," he said. "There's a creek on the east side. Runs low in summer, but it runs," she said, "and the grass comes back if the water comes back." He didn't answer, but he picked up the reins, and they came down off the rise toward it. The man named Cale Dunmore was coming out of the barn when they rolled in, older than she'd expected. Gray at the temples, a way of moving that said his knees had opinions about certain kinds of weather. The particular, slow deliberateness of a man who had learned not to rush, because rushing cost him more than it saved. He looked at Garrett first, then at Kiona, and something happened in his face. Not hostility, not exactly. Something more specific than that. Something more careful. His eyes went still in the way of a man who has just recognized something he wasn't expecting to recognize here. In this yard on this afternoon. She knew that look. She had grown up knowing soldiers' faces. The way a man looked when he was seeing not just what was in front of him, but everything attached to it. Cale Dunmore had been somewhere, had done something, and she was connected to that somewhere, that something in a way he had not been prepared for today. He said, "You got her." 2 words. Boss. Flat. He said nothing else. Just looked at her. Not unfriendly. Assessment. Pure and economic. The kind of place that didn't have time for pretending. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. He watched that. Something in his face shifted. Not warmth. Not yet. Something closer to. Noted. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard Cale say to Garrett, "Low, not low enough. Where'd you find her?" Not a question. A statement that wanted an explanation. And Garrett said, "Abilene." She answered the ad. "Garrett, she's here, Cale. Let it alone." A long pause. The kind that has weight in it, then the sound of the barn door. She walked into the house. The room off the kitchen was small. A cot. A hook on the wall. A window with no curtain, but glass was whole, which she counted as a point in the house's favor. Whole glass meant someone had cared about it. At some point, someone had thought, "This window matters. Let's not let it break." She set her bag on the cot and stood in the quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the 2 men talking low. The sound of a horse being unhitched, the creak of the barn door. The ordinary sounds of men who had routines they followed, because the routines were holding some together that wouldn't hold on its own. She unpacked the way she always unpacked. Practical things first. Her extra dress on the hook, her small tin of salt, her thread case, her bone-handled knife on the windowsill. She had learned years ago, don't leave necessities at the bottom of the bag. Because sometimes you needed the necessity fast, and the bottom of the bag was the wrong place to learn that lesson. She stood at the window and looked east. The land opened up past the near pasture. Pale grass running toward a low ridge, the kind of ridge that looked like the land had just exhaled. Past it, she couldn't see what was past it from here, but she felt something there. The way you feel water underground sometimes. Before you see it, before there's any rational reason to know it's there, just a pull, a direction. She would ride that way tomorrow. She went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. The wood box was nearly empty. She found kindling in a bucket by the door and wood stacked under the lean-to off the back. She built the fire without asking permission, because the fire needed building, and asking permission to build it would have been the same as asking permission to breathe, and she had spent enough years in enough houses not to do that anymore. She found beans on the shelf above the dry sink, salt pork tucked behind a sack of cornmeal, pushed so far back it had probably been forgotten, but she checked it and it was fine. And she sliced it thin and set it in the pan and stood back from the grease. By the time Garrett came in from the barn, she had water heating. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the stove. Looked at her. She said, "You want to eat tonight?" He took his hat off and hung it on the post by the door. He said, "Cale and I usually manage something," she said. "This will be better." He didn't argue. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table. She noticed he sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. A habit so old he probably didn't know he still had it. The kind of thing that gets trained into a man in certain kinds of years and never fully leaves. Cale came in. A few minutes later, he came in the way he did most things, deliberately, taking stock of the room before committing to it. He sat across from Garrett, without ceremony and without looking at her. She worked at the stove. She listened to the shape of their silence. It was a complicated silence. Garrett's was the silence of a man who had made a decision and was waiting to see what it cost him. Cale's was the silence of a man who was angry about something and had decided, for now, to keep it in his chest where it couldn't cause problems. She had lived inside complicated silences her whole life. She set the food on the table. Cale looked at his bowl, then looked at her, just briefly, just the corner of his eye, and said, "That's more than we've had it once in a while," she said. "I found the beans," he said. "We know where the beans are," she said. "Then you know where they'll be tomorrow." Something moved across his face. Not a smile, something adjacent to a smile. Something a smile might look like if it had been packed away for a long time and had gone slightly out of shape. She turned back to the stove after Garrett took his plate to the basin himself. Cale did the same. She hadn't expected that. In enough houses, you learned not to expect it. Someone had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was how it was done here. That told her something. She washed up while they went back out to the barn. The window above the basin had gone dark. Through the glass, she could see the pale shape of the first stars coming on over the ridge. 1, then 3, then more, until the ridge was the thing you couldn't see, and the stars were the thing you could. She dried her hands. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay on the cot in the small room and stared at the ceiling, and thought in Chiricahua, because that was what she did when she needed to think clearly. English was the language she navigated the world in. But thinking, real thinking, the kind that went under everything, happened in the first language. The one underneath all the others. She thought about Cale Dunmore, the way he had stopped. The particular stillness of a man who has just placed a face he wasn't expecting to place. She had seen it in men before, the ones who had been in the territory in the early 70s, when the Army was pushing hard through the passes between Arizona and Sonora. When the campaign to break the Chiricahua had been new and ruthless, and had not yet become the slow administrative thing it would later turn into. She thought about the year 1871, about what had happened in the mountains in March of that year. She thought about a man named Nochi, her husband's older brother, who had been 30 years old in March of 1871, who had a burn scar running the length of his left forearm, from wrist to elbow, from the time he was 26 and had pulled their cousin from a fire, and had left half the skin of his arm in the flame, and had never once mentioned it, as a sacrifice, only as a thing that had happened. She thought about Nochi, who could make a frightened horse trust him in 15 minutes, who had 4 children and argued with his wife about everything small and loved her with everything large, who sang to his horses in the mornings, off-key, cheerfully, unrepentantly off-key, in a way that the horses either loved or had simply accepted. She thought, is that what Cale Dunmore's face knows? She couldn't be sure. She wouldn't be sure until she knew more, and she would not know more until she knew what kind of man he was outside of that one moment, and what he did with what he was carrying, and whether he was the kind of man who carried a thing and drank it away, or the kind who carried it and read his Bible over and over, looking for somewhere to set it down. She thought she would learn that soon. She was good at learning things soon. She closed her eyes. She thought about the east window, about what she would see in the morning when the light came first. I can work with this. She didn't know yet what this was. Both of those things could be true at the same time. She was awake an hour before the sky changed color. She dressed in the dark the way she had dressed in the dark her whole life, by feel, by sequence, by the habit of hands that knew where everything was because she had put it exactly there the night before. She went to the kitchen and built the fire. She stood over it while the kindling caught and thought about what needed doing and in what order and what she had to work with. She found the salt pork she'd discovered the night before and sliced it thin and set it in the pan. Found cornmeal, found the coffee, set the water to heat. She stood at the window while the pan worked. The sky was beginning. That first change, not light, not yet, just the absence of a particular kind of dark. The ridge was there. The near pasture was there. The cattle were beginning to move, slow and deliberate as old men, toward the water trough at the fence line. She counted them without meaning to. 31, maybe 32, too few for this land. She could see that from here. She thought about the advertisement again, about the man who had placed it, about the words. The work would be steady and the arrangement honest. She thought about what it meant for a man to call something honest when most men in his position would have called it fair or good, or a real opportunity for the right woman. The word honest was specific. It was the word you used when you wanted someone to know you weren't going to make them guess. She thought, I will take that at face value until I have reason not to. She thought, I have been wrong about that calculation before. She thought, but not often. Garrett came in first. He stopped in the doorway the same way he had the night before, the same pause, the same taking stock. She didn't turn around, he said. You don't have to start that early, she said. The fire needs laying regardless. He came to the table and sat down. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. He said, Where did you find the pork? She said, Behind the cornmeal. He was quiet a moment. Then, that's been there since October. She said, It's fine. I checked it. He picked up his fork. She turned back to the stove, poured coffee, set the pot on the trivet, and went to the window and looked out at the light coming up over the grass. He said, Behind her, there were 50 head in the spring. She didn't turn around, she said. What happened? Dry summer. 2 went down with something, and the others followed. Lost 11 between July and September. She looked at the cattle moving along the fence line, 31. Maybe 32, moving in the pale, thin light, she said. I'd like to ride the fence line today. Silence. Then, Can you ride? She said. Yes. He nodded once and went to saddle the horses. Cale came in before she finished clearing up. He poured his own coffee. Stood at the window. He had been up since before her. She could tell by the way he held the cup, not warming his hands, just holding it. A man who had already been cold for a while. She said nothing. Worked at the basin. He stood there long enough that she thought he might leave without saying anything. Then he said, not looking at her, Your Chiricahua, not a question. A statement that was half a question, the kind you make when you're fairly sure and want confirmation. Not because you need it, but because naming a thing is different from knowing it. She said, Yes, he said. Dragoon Mountains, she said. My mother's family. My father's family was further south. Toward the border, he turned and looked at her then. Actually, looked at her. The assessment in his face was different from the night before. More complicated, more weighted. She looked back. She did not look away. She never looked away. She had learned that at 14 in the Dragoon Mountains from a grandmother who had said, The first one to look away loses the conversation before it starts. He said, I was in the territory. 1870 through 73, she said. I know, he said. How? She said, the way you stopped yesterday, the way you looked at me. I know what a man looks like when he's been in the territory in those years. It's a specific kind of looking. He held that, he said, I'm not going to cause trouble, she said. I didn't think you were. She turned back to the basin. He stood there a moment longer. Then he finished his coffee and set the cup on the counter. Not handed it to her, set it down himself, and went outside. She looked at the cup. She thought, 3 things about Cale Dunmore. He puts his own dishes away. He pours his own coffee. And he came to her with the truth before she had to dig for it. That was more than she'd expected. It didn't make him safe. But it made him something she could work with. The horses were ready when she got outside. Garrett had brought 2. His own, a dark roan, and a short bay mare with 1 white sock and a patient eye. He held the reins while she mounted. Didn't make anything of it, was already on his own horse before she'd gathered the reins, looking at the middle distance. They rode east first, along the lower fence. She didn't talk. He didn't either. The ground was harder than it should have been for October. She could see where the grass had come back in patches, sparse and pale green against the dry yellow of everything around it, and where it hadn't. There were sections along the fence where the earth was cracked in long, shallow lines. She slowed twice to look at them. He stopped both times without her asking. The second time she slowed, she dismounted. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It gave about an inch, stopped. She looked at the roots of the dead grass beside the fence post. Short, shallow. The roots of ground that had stopped expecting water. She looked at the roots for a moment. She thought about what that meant when a living thing learned to stop expecting. When the expectation itself became the problem. When you survived not by hoping but by contracting, by taking less. by reaching less deeply, because reaching and finding nothing was worse than not reaching at all. She had known people who had learned that. She stood and looked out at the pasture. She said, "Did you rotate them?" He said. "It's one pasture." She looked at him. He wasn't defensive. He said it the way you say a thing that has become obvious to you only recently. Too late for the obvious to help. She remounted. They continued. At the north end, where the land tilted and the fence followed a dry creek bed, she stopped again. There was grass here. More of it. Greener. Growing in the low ground, where moisture still held. A strip of maybe 40 yards running along the creek bed before it gave out and became dust. She looked at it for a long time. He said, "That's the only stretch that came back worth anything," she said. "How many acres do you have on the other side of that ridge?" He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the creek bed, he said. "Another 160. Fence ends here." She turned and looked at the ridge. It was nothing dramatic, a gentle rise, the kind the land made without thinking. But from where she sat, she could see that the grass on the near side was pale and exhausted. And the ground was hard in the way. Ground gets when water has been running off it, instead of into it for years. She asked what was on the other side. He said, "Old fence line from when my father ran more head than the land could hold. Mostly broken down by now." She asked when that was. He said, 16, 17 years ago. She sat with that. 16 years of a fence line falling apart, while the land on this side went with it. She said, "That moisture has to be going somewhere." He didn't answer right away. She heard his horse shift its weight behind her. He said, "There's a spring on the other side of the ridge. My father opened it up. But it silted back in." He paused. "Maybe 10 years ago. I've been meaning to clear it." He said it the way a man says, a thing he has not said for a long time. The way a thing sounds when it's been living in your chest instead of in the air, and the air is strange to it. She turned and looked at him. His expression was not the expression of a man who hadn't thought about it. It was the expression of a man who had thought about it, who had looked at it from a distance for years, and had decided somewhere along the way that the distance was the same as impossibility. She turned her horse toward the ridge. She said, "I want to see the spring," he said. "I can take you there," she said. "Tomorrow." She turned back toward the house, and as they rode, she thought, 10 years. He has been walking past the answer to his problem for 10 years. Not because he was stupid, not because he didn't see it. Because something in him had decided that seeing it and doing something about it were the same thing. And doing something about it required believing the thing could be fixed. And believing the thing could be fixed required believing things could still get better. She understood that she was 31 years old, and she understood exactly how a person learned to stop believing that. She also understood something else. She also suffered. She understood what it looked like when the ground was ready to come back. When the roots were short but still there. When the water was just waiting for someone to open the way. She had seen enough dead things to know which ones were actually dead, and which ones were only waiting. That night, she did not lie awake for as long. She lay on the cot and looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the house settle. Listened to the barn, quiet, the cattle. Quiet. Somewhere past the ridge, something moved through the grass. Wind or animal. She couldn't tell. She thought about the spring. She thought about 10 years. She thought about the way Garrett Aldous had said, "I've been meaning to clear it." Not as an excuse, as a confession. The specific tone of a man admitting to himself in public that he had given up on something without realizing he was giving up on it. She thought about what it meant that he kept driving after the man at the creek crossing. She thought about Cale Dunmore coming to her in the kitchen before she could come to him. She thought, these are not simple men. They are not easy men. But they are specific men. And specific is something you can work with. She closed her eyes. She thought about the east window. She thought about what the light would look like in the morning coming over the ridge. She thought, "I don't know what this is yet," she thought, but the bones are good. She let that be enough for now. Outside, past the kitchen and the barn and the corral, the first stars were thick over the ridge, and the grass moved in the particular way of grass when there is no wind. Just the quiet breathing of a large country that is not paying attention to anyone specifically, not yet. The light under Cale Dunmore's door was still on. She could see the thin line of it from where she lay. He was not sleeping, he was sitting with something. A Bible, maybe. Or nothing. Just sitting the way old men sit with things they don't know how to put down. She looked at that thin line of light for a moment. She thought, we will get there eventually. Whatever that conversation is, it will find its way to happening. She closed her eyes. She slept. And in the morning, she would build the fire and look at the light coming over the ridge. And ride to the spring and press her hands into the mud and find what was under it. Because that was what she did. She found what was under things. And she had learned over 31 years and too many hard seasons to count that what was under things was almost always still alive. You just had to know how to look. She was up before the sky decided what color it wanted to be, that hour between dark and dawn, the one that belongs to no one, the one that feels borrowed. She built the fire, set the coffee on, stood at the east window, and looked at the ridge, still gray, still waiting. She thought about the spring, 10 years of silt, 10 years of a man walking past the thing that could save him, not because he was careless, because grief does that. Grief narrows what you can see. It puts walls up at the edges of your vision, and after a while you stop noticing the walls are there. You just think, this is how wide the world is now, this small, this gray, this manageable. She knew that particular kind of narrowing. She had lived inside it for 4 years, so she understood Garrett Aldous in a way she hadn't expected to understand him, which was inconvenient. Because understanding a person made things complicated, and complicated was not what she had come here for. She had come here for the work. Just the work. She heard boots on the porch. He came in the way he always came in, stopped in the doorway, took stock. She didn't turn around. She said, coffee's ready. He poured his own cup and sat at the table. She set a plate in front of him and went back to the stove. He said, we ride to the spring after the cattle are watered, she said. I know, he said. It's rough ground past the north fence, she said. I grew up in the Dragoon Mountains. A pause. He said, right, she thought. He keeps forgetting that. Or he keeps remembering it, and then deciding it doesn't mean what it means. Which was fine. People needed time to recalibrate. She had learned patience the hard way. Not the soft kind of patience, the useful kind. The kind that waits because waiting is strategic. Not because waiting is comfortable. Nothing about waiting was comfortable, but some things were worth the wait. Cale was already at the north fence when they got there. He had ridden out early, checked the posts along the creek bed without being asked. Which told her something. Which told her he had been thinking about the spring too, or thinking about her. Or thinking about both in ways he hadn't sorted out yet. He looked at her when they rode up, nodded once. Then looked at Garrett, he said. Ground gets soft about a quarter-mile in, Garrett said. I know it, Cale said. Long-handled spades in the lean-to, Garrett said. I'll get it. Cale looked at Kiona again, then away. Not hostility. Not warmth either. Something she didn't have a word for yet. She kept riding. The ground changed 20 minutes north of the fence. She felt it before she saw it. The horse's stride went quieter. The hooves found a different texture under them. Not the dry-packed hardness of the overworked pasture, but something with give in it. Something that remembered water. The smell changed too. Mineral. Cool. Something that had been sealed under dry earth. A long time, and was now beginning to remember what the air was like. She slowed the mare. Garrett came up alongside her. He said nothing. Just watched her read the ground. And she was reading it. Every shift in the grass. Every place the soil changed color. The way the sedge grew in clusters that told you where moisture collected, even when you couldn't see any moisture. The way certain rocks didn't have the bleached-out look of stones that had been dry too long. She thought in Chiricahua, the water is here, below. Not gone, buried, waiting. Her grandmother had taught her that water never left. Not really. It went under. It went sideways. It found different channels. But the water that had always been here was still here. You just had to open the way. The spring was in a hollow between two rock outcroppings, low, muddy. A thin skim of standing water over dark silt. Dead sedge in a ring around the outer edge. The ghosts of plants that had lived here once and would again. She dismounted. She crouched at the edge and pressed her hand into the mud. It came up dark and wet, not the thin dampness of surface moisture after rain. Real water, close, pressing up from below like something that had been patient a very long time and was running out of patience. She felt the inlet shelf, the blockage. Compressed silt and gravel backed up against the rock, gradual, accumulative, the kind of silting that happened over a decade without anyone noticing, until one season the trough didn't fill, and by then the problem was too old to look at clearly. She stood. She looked at the face of the outcropping. And she stopped. Just stopped. The world went very quiet. On the rock ledge, half buried under dried sedge and lichen, worn by years of weather, but deliberate, unmistakably deliberate. A spiral, and branching from its center, 3 lines spreading outward like water, finding its channels. She knew this mark. She had seen it in the Dragoon Mountains. On a canyon wall near a water source her grandmother had shown her when she was 8 years old. Her grandmother had pressed her small hand to the rock and said, "This is how we leave our names in a place. Not carved deep, just enough. Just so the land knows we were here and we knew it. Watermark. Mark. We came here. We drank here. This place is known to us." Her people had stood at this spring, had knelt at this edge, had cupped this water in their hands, and drunk, had pressed their children's hands to this rock, and said, "Remember this place. Remember we were here," and then the years had come, the campaigns, the soldiers, the slow grinding movement of one world, replacing another, and the sedge had grown over the mark, and the silt had crept up the inlet, and the spring had gone quiet. But the mark was still there, underneath everything, still there. She put her hand flat against the rock. Below the markings, the stone was cold, and beneath the cold, something that wasn't quite warmth but was adjacent to it. The temperature of rock that has water behind it, not cold all the way through, just cold on the surface. She stayed like that. She didn't count the seconds. She could hear Garrett behind her. The stillness of a man who knows he is witnessing something private and is holding himself back from it with effort. She did not turn around. She was not ready to turn around yet. She thought, "This is my people's water. This is my people's mark. And I am standing here as a housekeeper on a man's land being paid to fix the thing that sealed it." And then she thought, before she could stop herself, "And the spring is still here. The mark is still here. My grandmother's hand was on this rock. Mine is on it now." She took a breath, she stood up. She turned around, she said, "We'll need the spade." He had already gone back for it. They dug in shifts. He cut the first layer, the top crust of compacted gravel that hadn't seen moisture in years. It came up in slabs, reluctant. The way things come apart when they've been compressed too long. Like they've forgotten they were ever loose. She took the next shift. The softer material below. Dark silt, almost liquid when the spade hit it right. She worked methodically, no wasted motion. She had learned to work that way in the Dragoon Mountains where wasted motion, in summer, could mean the difference between making it to the water source and not. They didn't talk. The hollow was quiet except for steel in wet earth. The occasional shift of a horse. The sound of their own breathing. She thought, there is something about working beside someone in silence that tells you more than any conversation. You learn how a person paces themselves, whether they stop before they need to or after. Whether they watch what you're doing and adjust, or whether they're somewhere else in their head while their body does the work. Garrett was present. Completely present, watching the ground, watching where the spade landed, adjusting when she adjusted, learning the shape of the blockage the same way she was learning it, through the resistance of it, through what it pushed back against. She thought, this man knows how to pay attention, which was rarer than people thought. Mid-afternoon, he hit something different. The spade went in, and the sound changed, hollow instead of flat, a note instead of a thud. He stepped back. They both looked at the cut. For a moment, nothing. Then water, seeping in, slow. The color of weak tea, cloudy with the silt it was moving through, carrying years of blockage with it. Then, clearing, slowly clearing. Like a thought becoming less complicated, neither of them spoke. She watched it and thought about 10 years. She thought about the mark on the rock. She thought about how long the water had been there, behind that shelf of silt, pressing, patient, not knowing that anyone was coming, not hoping, just being water, which meant being ready to move the moment it had somewhere to move. He said very quietly, 10 years. Just that, 2 words. And she understood he wasn't only talking about the spring. She said, second side tomorrow. There's still a shelf on the right that'll slow it. He nodded. Set the spade handle against his shoulder. Watched the water move. They rode back in the last of the daylight. She was tired, clean way, the kind that came from work that had gone the way work was supposed to go. The kind you could sleep through. He stayed alongside her the whole ride back. Not half a length ahead the way he usually did. Alongside, she noticed. Didn't decide anything about it. In the kitchen, she built the fire. He set the coffee on without being asked. She looked at the window. The last color had gone out of the sky. He set a cup on the counter near her, close enough. Didn't say anything. She wrapped both hands around it and stood there. She thought about the mark on the rock. She thought, I'm not going to tell him. Not yet. Not because it's a secret, because I'm not ready. Because some things need to be carried alone for a while before they can be shared, because the mark belongs to my people, and I need to sit with what it means. Before I hand it to anyone else, she thought, but I will tell him. Eventually, when I know what I want to say about it. She went back to the stove. The second side took most of the next morning. She had been right about the shelf. Limestone. Buried 3 feet under the bank's face. When the spade hit it, she felt the impact travel up through her wrists and into her shoulders before she heard the sound. Garrett crouched down. Looked at the angle, he said. 4 feet east, she said. Yes, they moved the line. Dug again. Added 2 hours to the work. But by noon, the flow was real. Running clean along the bottom of the hollow, pooling against the far outcropping. The dead sedge already standing in an inch of water, the roots of it still alive underneath. She had checked. She had crouched and pulled back the dead stalks and found green below, pale but green, waiting. She looked at the water for a long time. He stood beside her. He said nothing. And she thought, this is a man who knows when silence is the right thing, which was not the same as a man who is afraid of words. It was better than that. It was a man who understood that some moments didn't need to be filled. She said, it'll run stronger in a week. Once the channel clears, he said, how much stronger? She said. Enough for the south pasture by February if the grade runs right. I'd want to walk the channel between here and the creek bed. Clear any secondary blockages, he said. I'll go with you. She said, I know. That night, after supper, after Garrett had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen had gone quiet, Kiona sat at the table with the ledger. She had been avoiding it, not because she was afraid of numbers, because she knew what bad numbers looked like, and she had been preparing herself for what she was going to find. She opened it. She spent an hour. Then she sat back in her chair. She thought, oh, because it was not what she had expected. The situation looked like ruin on the surface. She had expected ruin. But the chaos was in the record-keeping, not in the underlying numbers. Receipts loose in a tobacco tin behind the dry sink. Columns mislabeled. Entries skipped for weeks at a time, always corresponding with the bad months. The months when Garrett had presumably been too deep in whatever the bad months. brought to sit down and write numbers in a book. But when she organized it, when she gave it a shape, the underlying situation was not ruin. Difficult, yes. Precarious, yes. But not ruin. There was a calf that would be ready to sell in 8 weeks. There was a partial debt payment to the bank in Delwood that was due before December and was manageable if the calf sold at fair market. There was a buyer in Tucson. She had read about him in the territory paper. A man who paid above market for stock from smaller operations because the quality was consistently better. And the calf would qualify. She worked through the numbers twice. Then she picked up her pen and wrote it out clearly. 1 page. Simple. The way you wrote something for a man who had been looking away from it for 3 years. She set it aside for morning. She thought, he has been standing in the middle of something that could be fixed and not being able to see that it could be fixed. Because grief had narrowed his vision. Because he had lost his wife and his herd in the same 2-year span, and the compounding of those losses had made everything look like more loss, she thought. I know that math, she thought. I know exactly how that math works. She found the dress on a Wednesday afternoon. She was looking for a second lantern. The lean-to off the barn had an assortment of things from different eras of the ranch's history. Old harness, broken tools, wooden crates that had been there so long the dust on them was its own kind of record. She moved a crate, found another behind it. The oilcloth wrapping was deliberate. Someone had wrapped this carefully. Someone had thought about protecting it. She should not have opened it. She opened it. Buckskin, soft with age. Beadwork along the collar and sleeves, mescalero pattern. She knew mescalero work. It was different from Kirikawa work in the bead spacing. In the colors chosen, in the way the design ran from the collar down rather than across. She held it. The woman who had worn this was Apache, mescalero, and she had been here, in this house, on this land, before Kiona. Before any of this, she wrapped it carefully. Placed it exactly as she had found it. She went back to the house. That evening, after supper, with Cale gone and the kitchen quiet, she looked at Garrett across the table. She said, the dress in the lean-to. He went very still. She said, mescalero, work on the beading. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, her name was Desahe. His voice was different saying it. Lower. Like the name lived somewhere below his everyday register. He said, she died October of 1873. Typhoid fever. A pause. She came here when there was nothing here yet. When it was just the land and the frame of the barn and an idea that it could be something. He stopped. She built this place with me. Kiona said nothing. He said, I didn't tell people in town. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, I know why too, he said. Not because I was ashamed of her, she said. I didn't think that, he said. Because they wouldn't have. He stopped, started again. Because there are things that belong to you and the person you lost, and not to anyone else. Not to a town that wouldn't have understood her when she was alive. She held that. She thought about her husband. About the grief of losing someone in a language the world around you didn't speak. Carrying the lost in a place where no one asked about it. Not because they were cruel. Because they didn't know. The question existed, she said. The dress should come out of the lean-to. He looked at her, she said. Not to display it. Just to keep it somewhere that's not a crate. He was quiet for a moment, he said. I know it should, she said. I'll leave that to you. She went back to the ledger. Cale found her the next morning. She was at the east window. He came in from the bunkhouse earlier than usual, poured his coffee and stood on the other side of the kitchen. He said, he told you about Dessa, she said. Yes. He said, he never told me. She turned and looked at him. He said, 4 years. I worked beside that man for 4 years. And I never knew. He said it without accusation. With something more complicated than accusation. I thought she was a woman from the East. A settler's wife. I never. He stopped. She said, you never asked. He said, no. She said, why not? He looked at his coffee. He said, because in those years, you learned not to ask certain things. Because the answer might be complicated. And complicated in those years, complicated cost you. She looked at him, she thought, there it is. Not malice, not cruelty. Just the particular cowardice of a man who had trained himself not to look sideways, and had done it so long, he'd forgotten it was a choice because looking sideways was dangerous, who had made that calculation so many times it had become invisible to him, who didn't even know he was making it anymore, she said. And was it worth it? He said. What? She said, not asking, not looking sideways. Was it worth it? A very long pause. He said, no. She turned back to the window, she said. The numbers in the ledger are better than they look. I'll show Garrett after breakfast. Cale said nothing. She said, there's salt pork in the pan. He got his plate. She showed Garrett the ledger page after breakfast. He sat at the table and read it, then read it again. She watched his face while he read it. The way his expression moved through something. Not quite disbelief, because the numbers were plain and he could see they were plain. Something more like, I had stopped believing this was possible, and now I am having to believe it again. And I'm not sure my belief is in working order. He said, the calf, she said. Ready in 8 weeks. The buyer in Tucson pays above market for stock from smaller operations. I read about him in the territory paper, he said. You read the territory paper, she said. I read everything I could find. At the reading room in Abilene. Land law, cattle regulations, territory business records, water rights. She paused. Knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you at the door. He looked at her, she said. Make the partial payment to the bank before December. That buys you the spring. In the spring, the grass comes back in the south pasture. By fall, you're carrying 60 head instead of 30, he said. You got all that from the ledger, she said. I got all that from the ledger and from riding your fence line and from 2 days at the spring. He sat back in his chair, he said. In 3 days, she said. Yes. He looked at the numbers again, he said very quietly. I should have been looking at this, she said. You were looking at other things. He said. That's not, she said. It's not an excuse. It's just true. You were looking at other things. Now you're looking at this. He was quiet. Then he said, I'll go to the bank Thursday. She said, go Thursday. The manager is better on Thursdays. He looked at her. She said, the woman at the general store told me. He has lunch on Wednesdays and he drinks at it. A pause. And then Garrett Aldous did something she hadn't seen him do before. He almost smiled. Not quite. Just the edge of it. Just the place where a smile would be if he let it. She turned back to the ledger. She thought, there you are. Warren Proust arrived on a Thursday in December. He rode in the way men like him always rode in. Unannounced. Announcing yourself gave the other person time to prepare. And men like Proust depended on catching people unprepared. He was perhaps 54. Well-dressed for the territory, not flashy, just precise. The kind of man whose clothes said, I have the resources to look like this, and I want you to know it. A practiced manner. A practiced smile. Kiona watched him from the kitchen window before he even dismounted. She thought, landman. The posture of someone who was calculating the value of everything he looked at. The barn, the outbuildings, the corral. His eyes moved the way appraisers' eyes moved, quick, systematic, always returning to the same points. He asked for coal. Kiona thought, coal again. Not Aldous, but she went and got Garrett. She stayed near the kitchen door. She listened. Proust made Haushofer. Numbers that were, she calculated quickly, about 60% of what the ranch was worth even in its current state. He framed it as generosity. He talked about the difficulty of the land, the drought, the state of the market, the burden of debt to the Delwood Bank. Garrett said, I'm not selling. Proust said, I understand. These decisions are emotional. I respect that. Garrett said, I'm not being emotional. I'm being clear. Proust looked at the kitchen window where Kiona was standing. He said, I heard you'd taken on an Apache woman. Garrett said, I've taken on a housekeeper. Proust said, I want you to understand the position that puts you in this county. With people who remember what happened in the territory in '71, Garrett said, I think you should go. Proust said. I'm trying to help you, Aldous, Garrett said. You're trying to get my land. Proust smiled. Still patient. Still practiced, he said. I'll come back when you've had time to think, he wrote out. Garrett stood in the yard and watched him go. He stood there for a long time after the dust settled. Then he came inside. She was already at the stove. She said without turning around, he'll come back. And the next time won't be an offer. Garrett said, What do you mean, she said. Men like that have a process. First they offer. When you say no, they find a reason. A legal reason, something that looks legitimate. She turned and looked at him. She said, He'll use the spring. Garrett said, The spring is on my land, she said. I know it is. But a man with the right connections and the wrong map can make almost anything look like almost anything else. Do you have the original survey documents? He looked at her. He said, In the strong box. Under the, she said. Get them out. Tonight. I want to see them. He got them out. She spread the survey documents on the kitchen table, Vault 1869. Original survey by a man named Calloway. Clear lines. The spring was inside the Aldous boundary. Unmistakably, she looked at it for a long time. She thought, This is good. This is clear enough that a judge would have to willfully misread it to rule against it. Which meant if Proust came back with a challenge, the challenge would not be about this document. It would be about a different document, a newer one. One that redrew the lines. She had read enough land law in Abilene to know how that worked. She said, Is there a lawyer in Tucson you trust? Garrett said, A man named Maddox. He handled my father's land transfer. He's careful, she said. We may need him, Garrett said. We. She looked at him. He said, You said we. She said, I know what I said. Proust came back 2 weeks later. He came with papers. A survey map, dated 1874, 5 years after Calloway's original, showing a revised boundary line, showing the spring on territory land, not Aldous land. Kiona stood in the doorway and looked at the map. She thought, There it is. She said, Can I see the map? Proust looked at her. Then at Garrett. Garrett said, Show her. Proust handed her the map. She looked at it. At the legend. At the surveyor's mark. At the date, she said. This is a 1874 survey, Proust said. Correct, she said. The territory adopted new surveying standards in 1875. Any survey conducted before that date that conflicted with an original survey required a formal dispute proceeding before it could be used in a land claim. Proust looked at her. She said, Was there a formal dispute proceeding for this survey? A pause, she said. I'll take that as a no. Which means this map has no legal standing. It's a document. It's not a claim. Proust's practiced smile went somewhere else. He said, That's a creative interpretation, she said. It's the correct one. There's a lawyer in Tucson named Maddox who will confirm it. You could also look it up yourself in the territory records. The territory adopted new surveying standards after 1874. Any conflicting survey required a formal dispute proceeding before it carried legal weight. There was no proceeding for this map. She paused. I can write it down if you need it. Proust was quiet for a long moment. He said, I'll need to consult, she said. Of course. He wrote out. Garrett turned and looked at her. She said, He'll look it up. When he looks it up, he'll know it's exactly what I said it was. He'll need to decide if it's worth continuing, Garrett said. And if he decides it is, she said, then we go to Tucson. They went to Tucson. 2 days' ride. Stayed at a way station the first night. Separate rooms, plain food. The kind of place that existed to get people from one place to another, and didn't try to be more than that. She sat at the small table in her room and looked at the survey documents she'd brought and thought about Proust's face when she'd cited the surveying provision. The quality of his surprise. Not that she knew the law, that she knew that law, that inconvenient, obscure provision. She had read every territory document in the Abilene reading room, not because someone told her to, because she understood at 31, with 4 years of hard lessons behind her, that the world was organized by documents, that the people who controlled the documents controlled everything else. and that the only way to fight a document was with another document. So she had learned the documents, all of them. She thought. No Chi would have understood that. He had been the same way with horses. Learned everything about them, not from books, from years of paying attention, from watching what frightened them, and what calmed them, and what they needed before they needed it. The first one who understands the animal wins, he had told her once. She had been maybe 12. It doesn't matter what size you are. It matters what you know she thought about him now. She did that sometimes, involuntarily. In quiet moments, she let herself think about him for a minute. Then she put it away. She picked up the survey documents again. Maddox was 60 years old and precise in the way of men who had spent decades untangling other people's messes. He looked at Kiona's documents first. Then at Proust's map, he said, "The 1874 survey," she said. "No formal dispute proceeding?" He said, "No," he said. Then, "It's not a claim," he looked at her. "You know the surveying standards the territory adopted after 1874, she said. The conflicting survey provision, yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Where did you study law?" she said. "At the reading room in Abilene." He said, "By yourself?" She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, and the weeple sometimes looked at her when they were recalibrating something fundamental. She was used to it. She was patient with it. He said, "I'll write to the county sheriff and the territory judge. Reference the 1869 survey, the absence of dispute proceedings, and the 1875 Act." "Proust will know the challenge won't hold," Garrett said. "And if he tries another way," Maddox said, "he will. But it'll take time. Time you should use." He looked at both of them. "A profitable operation is the best argument against a man who's counting on you to stay desperate." She thought, "I know. I've already started." On the road back, the second evening, the light was going flat, and the horses had found their rhythm, and there was nothing left to plan or argue or prepare for. That was when he said it. She used to do that. She looked at him. He said, "Dessa." Ride quiet and then say the thing she'd been thinking for the last hour. He was looking at the road ahead. He said, "She came from a family near the Hondo River, in the Tularosa Basin. She left when she was 19. Came north." He paused. "I met her in a town called Draper. She was working at a trading post. Her English was better than mine." A pause. "I didn't tell her. I thought that for 2 years," she said. "Why not?" he said. "Because then she'd know I was paying attention," she said. "She already knew," he said. "I know she already knew." A pause. He said, "She built the south pasture fence, herself, the first one. Before I had money to hire hands. She said I was taking too long about it." He stopped. "She was right," he said. "She died in October. The 3rd year. We'd had the best summer we ever had. The grass was green all the way to the ridge. The herd was up to 53 head. He was quiet. October came, and she had a fever, and by November she was gone. And by December the grass was dead. And by the following spring I had 41 head, and I didn't look at the ledger for 18 months. She said nothing. He said, "I should have looked at the ledger," she said. "You were looking at other things." He said, "You said that before," she said. "It's still true." He looked at the road, he said. "Her name was Dessa. Her family called her that. I called her Dessa, because she said Desahi was for people who knew her before she became herself." A pause. She never explained what that meant. "I never asked," Kiona thought. "I know what it meant," she said. "It means the name I was born with. Before the world taught me who I had to be in it." He looked at her. She looked at the road ahead. She said, "Some names are for after. The name you earn when you know who you actually are." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What's yours?" She said, "Kiona. My grandmother gave it to me when I was 3 days old." She said I looked like I already knew what I thought about everything, Garrett said. She wasn't wrong, and she thought, no, she wasn't. They came back to the ranch on a Thursday evening. Cale was at the gate. He had fixed it. She had noticed for weeks that the latch was stiff, had been working around it, lifting and pulling in a specific sequence she had developed without meaning to, like a small private language between her and the gate, and now it swung clean. Easy, like it had always been that way. She opened and closed it once. Cale was already walking back to the barn. He didn't look over. She thought. He did that while we were gone. He noticed. He fixed it, without being asked, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, something. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot and looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the house. She thought about Desahi, who had built the first fence, who had left when she was 19 and come north and made a life on land that wasn't what the land office said it was, and wasn't what her people's history said it was, and was both of those things and neither. She thought about the mark on the spring rock. She thought Desahi might have known about that mark. She might have found it herself. She might have stood at that spring with her hand on that rock and felt exactly what I felt. She thought, we are not the same person. We came from different nations, different families, different histories. I did not know her and she did not know me. But we stood at the same spring. We put our hands on the same rock. We chose to stay on the same piece of ground. That was something. She thought, I will tell Garrett about the mark. Not tonight. Not yet, but soon. 'Cause he said she built this place with me, and if she knew about the mark, if she put her hand there, then he deserves to know. She thought, when I know how to say it, I'll say it. She looked at the east window, dark still, hours before the sky would change. She thought about what Cal had said that morning in the kitchen. No, it wasn't worth it. Said without self-pity, without asking for anything. Just said it. Put it down on the table between them, like a card he was finally ready to show. She thought, there is still something coming with Cale. Something heavier than what's already been said. She could feel it the way she could feel the water under the dry ground. Not seeing it. Just knowing the shape of what was below, she would be ready when it came. She was always ready. That was the thing about paying attention. You didn't always know what you were preparing for. But you were prepared. She closed her eyes. Outside the window, past the near pasture and the south fence and the ridge that separated this land from what lay beyond it. The spring running, clean now. Clear moving through the channel they had cut with their own hands, finding its way. The letter from Maddox arrived on a Monday. Short. Precise. The way legal correspondence was supposed to be, and rarely was. Proust had withdrawn. Kiona read it at the kitchen table while the coffee was still hot. Read it once. Set it down. Picked up her pen and went back to the ledger column she had been working on before the postwriter came. Garrett came in an hour later. She slid the letter across the table without looking up. He read it. He set it down. He said, "That's done then," she said. "For now," he said. "You think he'll try again?" She said, "I think men like that find easier ground eventually. We made this ground harder than it was worth." He was quiet, she said. "The bank payment clears Thursday. After that, the debt is restructured, and Proust has no angle through the loan either," he said. "You already thought about that," she said. "I think about several things at once. It's more efficient." He almost smiled again. She had started to know those almost smiles, the way they came and went. The way his face considered something and then thought better of it. Like a man who had learned that warmth cost something and was still calculating whether he could afford it, she thought. "You can afford it." She didn't say that. She went back to the numbers. January came in cold and honest. No pretending. No half measures. Just cold, the kind that meant it. Ice on the water pails every morning. She broke it with the heel of her palm. One strike. Clean. No hesitation. The cold came up through the skin of her hand and stayed there for a while after. She had learned years ago not to fight that feeling. Just let it move through and out the other side. The cattle had shifted their patterns. She noticed it before Garrett mentioned it. The way they moved in the south pasture now. Slower. Less urgent. The ease of animals that had stopped rationing themselves. They still drifted toward the trough at the fence line. But they drifted. They didn't rush. Drifting was different from rushing. Drifting meant they trusted the water would be there. She stood at the east window one morning and watched them and thought, that's what it looks like. When something that was terrified finally stops being terrified, not joy, not celebration, just the quiet lowering of a guard that had been up so long. The animal forgot it was a guard and thought it was just the way of things. She understood that feeling too. The first calves came before dawn on a Wednesday. She was out before the sky changed color, lantern in one hand. Her coat buttoned wrong in the dark, third button through the second hole, which she didn't notice until she was halfway to the pasture and didn't care enough to fix. Garrett was already there. He had been out since 3, he said. Flat. Matter of fact. The way he said everything that mattered, as if it was just information. As if it wasn't a man who had been standing in a cold pasture alone for 2 hours in January, because he was not the kind of person who let things happen without him. She didn't say anything about the 2 hours. She took the left side of the pasture. He took the right. They worked in the silence of people who had stopped needing to announce themselves. She knew when he was moving toward a cow that was close. She knew when he was waiting and watching versus moving in. She knew the sound of him crouching down, which was different from the sound of him standing up, which she could somehow tell even in the dark, even without looking, which was strange, which she tried not to think about too carefully. 3 calves. One easy, one less easy, but fine. One small and slow. The kind of small that worried you even when everything was technically going right. The small one was on its feet by mid-morning, fell twice. The third time it stayed up and stood there wobbling, with the pure stubbornness of a creature that had made up its mind, regardless of what its legs thought about it. She and Garrett stood at the fence watching it. Neither of them said anything for a while. He said, "That one's going to give us trouble," she said. "Probably," he said. "You're not going to argue with me," she said. "About what?" He said, "That it'll be fine," she said. "I don't know if it'll be fine. I know it stood up. That's what I know right now." He looked at her. She said, "I don't lie to people to make them feel better," he said. "I know," she said. "Does that bother you?" He said, "No." A pause. "It's no. It doesn't bother me." She looked at the small calf. Still wobbling. Still upright. She thought, stand up, stay up. That's the whole job. Everything else comes after. Cale found her at the spring in February. She had been going up alone once a week, not to check the flow. She could see the creek feeding the south pasture from the fence line. She went because she needed to go. Because the spring was the place where something had happened in her that she didn't have a name for yet, and she needed to keep going back until she did. She was crouched at the water's edge, hand in the current. Cold that moved rather than sat. The kind of cold that told you it was going somewhere. She heard him before she saw him, the particular heftiness of Cale Dunmore's step on uneven ground, his knees on the rocks. She knew that sound. She had cataloged it without meaning to. The way she cataloged everything, the way she cataloged everything. Stopped a few feet away. He stood there. She kept her hand in the water, and she thought, here it is, the thing she had felt coming since the first night. Since the kitchen. Since the way he had looked at her and gone still. Since every careful weighted silence between them that had been building up to this. She waited. He stood there for a long time, long enough that she thought maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was something else. Maybe he had just come to check the water. Then he said, March of 1871. 2 words. Month and year. She stilled. Not on the outside. On the inside. The outside stayed exactly the same. Hand in the water. Back straight. Breathing slow. But inside something went very quiet. He said, there was a campaign. Along the border. Arizona, Sonora. He stopped. Started again. Slower. A small camp. Chiricahua. We were told they were hostile. We were told to clear the camp. He stopped again. I knew they weren't hostile. I knew it. The camp was there were women. There were children. It was not a war camp. She said nothing. He said there was a man. He was standing in the middle of the camp when we came through. Not running. Not fighting. Just standing. Like he was rooted there. Like the ground was part of him. He said it slowly. Working toward something he'd been working toward for a long time. He had a burn scar, his left arm. From the wrist to the elbow, her hand stopped moving in the water. Just stopped, he said. I need you to know that I knew it was wrong. In the moment, I knew it. And I did it anyway, because there was an order, and because I was afraid. And because I had told myself so many times that following the order was the same as being right, that I couldn't tell the difference anymore. She was very still. She thought, say something, say something. She couldn't say anything yet. He said, I don't know his name. I've needed to know his name for 5 years and I don't know it and I can't look it up and I can't ask. And I came here because… He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. The roughness at the edges of a man passing close to something he hadn't visited in years. I came here because you know who he was. And I need to know. I need to know who he was. Not just what I did. The spring ran. The dead sedge moved in a small wind. She took her hand out of the water. She pressed it flat against her thigh. She thought, Nochi, she thought, burn scar, left arm, wrist to elbow, standing like a man with roots. Not running, not fighting. That was Nochi. That was exactly Nochi. She knew it the way you know the voice of someone you love. Not by analyzing it, by recognizing it below analysis. In the place where knowledge, before it becomes language. She stood up. She turned around. She looked at Cale Dunmore. Really looked at him. Not the way she had been looking at him for the past weeks, cataloging, assessing, measuring the distance between what he was and what he had done. Just looked at him. A man who was 58 years old and had been carrying a weight for 5 years and had finally found the person he needed to put it down in front of. She thought, I cannot give you what you want, and I'm not going to pretend I can, because pretending would be the cruelest thing I could do, easier for you. But a lie, she said. His name was Nochi. His face moved. She said, he was my husband's older brother. He was 30 years old in March of 1871. She said it in a level voice. Steady. Not because she wasn't feeling it. Because she had made a decision about how she was going to do this, and she was going to do it that way. He had 4 children. He had been married since he was 22. His wife's name was Hazel in English. In our language, it was something longer that I won't translate because it doesn't translate. Cale had gone very still. She said he got that scar when he was 26. One of his younger cousins fell into a fire during a storm, a bad one. Things catching. He went in and pulled the boy out, and the fire took the skin off his left arm from wrist to elbow, and she stopped for 1/2 second. He never mentioned it like it was a sacrifice. He said, the fire was there, the boy was there, someone had to go in. That was all. She paused. She said he was the best horseman I ever knew, not the most skilled, the best. There is a difference. Skill is technique. Best means the horse chose him. Always. A horse that wouldn't let anyone near it would walk to Nochi. He never explained how. I think he thought it was obvious. I think he thought everyone could do it, and most people just weren't paying close enough attention. She paused again. She said, he sang to his horses in the mornings. Every morning, off-key, cheerfully, completely off-key, in a way that should have been terrible and somehow wasn't. The horses didn't mind. His wife minded. She told him every morning he was going to ruin them. He told her every morning that music was medicine, even if it was bad music. She stopped. He believed that. Cal was not moving. She said, he had 4 children, and he argued with his wife about everything small and loved her with everything large. He was not a warrior. He was a horseman and a father and a man who pulled a boy from a fire and never called it courage, because to him it wasn't courage. It was just what you did when someone needed it. She stopped. She said, that is who you killed. And then she said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. Because she was not going to give him absolution. She was not going to say, I understand. I forgive you. It was a different time. You were young. You were following orders. All of those things might have been true, and not one of them was hers to give. What she could give him was a name and the shape of the person who had that name. That was all she had. That was all she was going to offer. Cale stood there. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Nochi, just the name." Like he was learning it, like he was making himself learn it. She said, "Remember it." He said, "I will," she said. "Not how he died. That's yours to carry. What he was good at. The horses, the singing, his wife's name, his 4 children. Remember that," he said. "I will." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned back to the spring. She heard him walk away, his footsteps on the rock, the sound of his knees on the uneven ground, moving slowly, not differently from before. But she thought there was something in the weight of it that had shifted. Not lighter, just different in its heaviness. The difference between carrying something you can't name and carrying something you can. She waited until she couldn't hear him anymore. Then she put both hands on the rock face, flopped, palms down, below the mark, below the spiral, and the 3 branching lines. And she stood there. And for the first time since she had arrived in this county, since the post office steps, since the letter, since the broken clasp and the canvas bag, and the long ride out on a buckboard with a man who couldn't look at his own ledger, for the first time in 4 years, she cried. Not because of Cale. Not exactly. Not because of what he had said, or what he had admitted, or what he could never take back. She cried because she had found the place to put it down. Because she had been carrying Nochi and her husband and her daughter, and 4 years of rooming houses and altered clothes, and being precisely what each situation required her to be. And she had been carrying it alone, in Kirikawa, in the language underneath all the other languages. And there was no one to carry it to, until now, until this spring, until this rock with this mark on it. Her people had stood here, she stood here now. And the water was running. She pressed her forehead against the cold rock and stayed like that for a while. Then she stood up straight, wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a breath, looked at the water. It was running clean, clear, moving through the channel with the confidence of something that had always known where it was going and had just needed someone to open the way. She thought, "I'm still here." She thought, "Nochi is still a name in the world." She thought, "The spring is running." She picked up her coat from the rock where she'd set it, put it on, and walked back to the house. Spring came fast that year, faster than either of them expected. Faster than the land had any reason to deliver after the years it had been through. But the water from the spring reached the south pasture in the first week of March, and the grass followed the water the way it always did, thin first, a color that was almost green, trying to be green, committing to green by the second week, then thicker, then actual grass, the kind you could put cattle on and mean it. The cattle noticed. She watched them from the fence line, the morning the south pasture started to green. And she watched the herd move toward it, and she watched the small calf from January, still small, always going to be small, but upright, permanently upright, as if it had decided that first morning to never fall again. "Move with the others," she said, out loud to no one. There you go. The 2 brothers named Lafleur arrived the second week of March. From the next county, they came with their own horses, their own gear, and a combined total of maybe 40 words over the course of the first 3 days, which she appreciated. She had enough complicated silences already. Uncomplicated ones were a relief. They knew cattle. You could see it in how they moved around the herd. Easy, unhurried. The way people moved around things, they understood completely. She thought, good. She thought, 60 head by fall. The numbers work. The numbers already work. The ledger was clean now. 3 months of clean entries, properly organized, correctly labeled. She had taught herself a shorthand for the recurring expenses that saved her 15 minutes every week. She had not mentioned this to anyone. It was just a thing she had done, because it made the work more efficient, and the work being more efficient mattered. Garrett came in one evening and found her at the table and looked at the ledger over her shoulder without asking if he could. She let him. He said, "What's that column?" She said, Supply costs by category. So you can see at a glance where the money is going without reading every line. He said, "When did you add that?" She said, "February." He said, "I didn't notice." She said, "I know." He said, "It's useful." She said, "I know that too." He went and poured his coffee. She went back to the numbers, and she thought, "This is what it looks like. Not fireworks, not declarations, just a man standing behind you, looking at a ledger column you added in February, and saying it's useful. Just two people who have been making the same place function for months and have stopped thinking about it as your part and my part, and have started thinking about it as the work, which was either very simple or very significant. She was still deciding which. Kale was different after the spring, not transformed. She had not expected transformation. Transformation was for stories that needed a clean ending. Real people didn't transform. They adjusted. They absorbed. They became slightly different versions of themselves, with the bad kneesies and the same old coffee habits and the same silences, but with something altered in the texture of the silences. He started saying her name. Not often, not casually, but he stopped saying her and started saying Kiona. And she noticed because she noticed everything, and because it mattered the way names always matter. He held doors. Not in the exaggerated way of a man performing courtesy, just the natural way of a person who had decided that holding the door was the right thing to do, and was now doing it because it was right. One morning he came in and said, without preamble, "The small calf's ear tag needs replacing." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll do it this morning." She said, "I was going to." He said, "I'll do it." She said, "We could both do it." He looked at her. She said, "It's a two-person job if the calf is difficult," he said. "The calf is always difficult." She said, "I know." And they went together. The calf was, as predicted, extremely difficult. It took 40 minutes and the involvement of one of the LaFleur brothers who happened to be passing and stopped to watch with the enjoyment of a man watching something that was not his problem. Kiona said several things in Chiricahua that she didn't translate. The LaFleur brother laughed. Kale said, "I don't want to know." She said, "No, you don't." The tag got replaced. The calf made its feelings about this known to everyone within a quarter mile. She and Kale walked back to the barn afterward, in a silence that was, for the first time, simply silence. Not weighted. Not complicated. Not carrying anything extra. Just two people who had just replaced an ear tag on a difficult animal. She thought, oh. She thought, so that's what that feels like. The Territory newspaper ran a piece in June. She found it at the post office on a Thursday. Read it standing on the same steps where she had read the letter back in October, which she noticed, which felt like something, though she didn't stop to decide what. The piece covered the ranch, acreage, head count, the spring restoration, the expansion toward the south pasture. They got most of the numbers right. They got the dates slightly wrong. And they described her as a woman of unknown origin, employed as domestic help. She stood on the steps. She thought, unknown origin, she thought they have a lot of nerve. She thought, I have a pencil. She took out her pencil. She wrote in the margin, in her clear, exact handwriting, Chiricahua, Apache, Dragoon Mountains. Origin known perfectly well. She folded the paper, went home, tucked it into the front of the ledger. Between the pages where she had started keeping a record of the years. Not just the numbers, the events. What happened when. What the land did. What they did back. She didn't mention it to anyone. Garrett found it, 3 days later. She was at the stove and heard him stop at the table. Heard the ledger open. Heard the particular quality of silence that meant he was reading something he hadn't expected. Then she heard the ledger close. She said without turning, "The numbers for May are on the left side of the page behind it," he said. "I wasn't looking at the numbers." She said, "I know." A pause. He said, "Chiricahua, Apache. Dragoon Mountains," she said. It seemed like the correct information, he said, "Benone, origin known perfectly well." She said, "Also correct." Another pause. She heard him set the ledger back on the shelf. He said, "They spelled your name right at least." She said, They did, he said. Small mercies, she said. I'll take them. And she heard something in his voice that she had not heard before. Not the almost smile. Actual warmth. The kind that didn't retreat. The kind that just was there. In the air of the kitchen, in the ordinary morning light, she kept her eyes on the stove. Careful, don't make it bigger than it is. But don't make it smaller either. She didn't know yet which it was. She would figure it out. Cale found the ledger page on a Saturday. He came in for coffee, saw the ledger sitting open. She had left it out by accident, which was unusual. She never left it open and looked at it. She was in the back kitchen when she heard him stop. She came to the doorway. He was standing at the table with the ledger open to the clipping page, looking at her handwriting in the margin. Not reading it, he had read it. He was just standing with it. She waited. He closed the ledger. He didn't say anything. He went outside. She watched him through the window. He walked to the yard and stood there, looking at nothing in particular. The way he did when he was thinking about something that didn't have a clean conclusion. He stood there a while. Then he went to the small calf's enclosure. Just stood there too, looking at the calf. For once, didn't seem to have strong opinions about being looked at. She watched from the window. She thought, he's doing what people do when they need a place to put something. He came in the kitchen. Too much. Too interior. He went outside. Too open. Too exposed. So he's standing at the calf enclosure. The calf doesn't ask anything of him. Just stands there being a small, perpetually opinionated animal. She thought, I understand that. She went back to the stove. One evening in late June, she was at the table with the ledger. The door opened. Garrett came in from the south pasture, dusty, tired in the way that meant the day had gone right. He crossed to the table without saying anything and set something on the corner of the open ledger. A small bundle, dried grass. The kind with the seed head still intact. She recognized it. South pasture grass. The grass that had come back, not flowers. Grass, because that was what the land had offered. And he had bent down and picked it up and brought it in without thinking too carefully about the gesture. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was already walking to the basin to wash his hands. Back to her. Not waiting to see what she did with it. She looked at the grass for a long time. She thought, this is a man who brought me the thing that came back, who picked up a handful of the proof that the thing they had been working toward had actually worked, and brought it in and put it down without ceremony. She thought, that is either nothing at all or the most significant thing anyone has done for me in 4 years. She thought, it is not nothing. She left the grass where it was. She went back to the numbers, and the numbers blurred slightly, and she let them blur. And she looked at the dried seed heads on the corner of the ledger and thought about spring water and dead sedge and things that had been underground a long time and had come back. She told him about the mark on a Sunday. She had decided on Friday that she was going to. She had spent Saturday thinking about how, not what to say. She knew what to say, how to begin. Because beginning was always the part that cost the most, she said, when they were riding up to check the spring flow. There's something on the rock I want to show you, he said. All right, just that. All right. Like she had said, there was something to show him and he was ready to see it. Which was exactly the right answer. She showed him the mark. She told him what the spiral meant, the 3 lines. The vocabulary of the mark, not decoration, not art, geography. A living map. Her people's version of a deed. Not legal, not territorial, something older and more honest than both of those things. We came here. We knew this place. We left our mark so the place would know it was known. He looked at it for a long time. He said, how old? She said, before your father. Before anyone in your family, he said. Before the land office. She said, yes. He stood there. She let him stand there. He said, Dessa might have seen this. She said, I think she did. He said, she never told me, she said. Some things you carry alone for a while, before you can share them. He looked at her. She looked at the mark. She said, I'm telling you now, because you should know. Because she built this land with you, and if she knew about this mark, then it's part of what she knew. And you deserve to know what she knew. He was very quiet. Then he said, Desahi, just the name. The full one. The one he had told her on the road back from Tucson. The one that was four before. She said, yes, he said. She would have stood here, she said. I think she stood exactly here. He put his hand on the rock, below the mark, right where she had put hers. He stood like that for a moment, his hand on the cold rock, the spring running below them, the sky open above. She looked at his hand on the rock and thought, there is the moment, right there. A man putting his hand where his wife's hand might have been, where her people's hands were, where her own hand had been. She thought, this land holds everyone who has ever stood on it. It doesn't forget. It can't forget. It's not built to forget. The water is still the same water. The rock is still the same rock. The mark is still the mark. He took his hand down. He said, thank you for showing me, she said. I thought you should know, he said, if any of your people ever need to come here. To the spring, she said. There's almost no one left who knows this place, he said. But if there were, she held that for a moment. She said, that is a generous thing. He said, it's the right thing. She looked at the spring. She said, it's both. The summer moved the way a good summer moves, without drama, without announcing itself. Just accumulating days that went right, days where the grass held and the water ran, and the cattle were healthy, and the numbers in the ledger went in the correct direction. The LaFleur brothers extended their arrangement through fall. Neither one said much about it. They just stayed. Which was its own kind of statement. Cale started sleeping better. She knew because the light under his door was dark before 10 o'clock. Which was new, which was not nothing. She started going to the east window later in the mornings, not because she woke up later, because she was starting to find that she could sleep through the night and wake when she meant to, rather than when her body decided the night was over, which was a thing she had stopped noticing she'd lost. Until she got it back. That was how most things worked. You didn't notice what you were missing until it came back. And then you stood there thinking, oh, that was what that was supposed to feel like. I forgot. She found the dress on the chair in her room one morning. Not in the lean-to, not in the crate, on the chair folded, careful. The oilcloth wrapper set beside it, not around it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She crossed to the chair and picked up the dress, held it. The buckskin was soft with age. The beadwork caught the morning light from the east window and threw small colored patterns on the whitewashed wall. She thought about Des Sahi, who had come from the Hondo River country and gone north at 19 and built the first south pasture fence with her own hands. Because Garrett was taking too long about it, she thought. I would have liked you, she thought. I think you would have understood me, she thought. I think we would have argued about things and been right in different ways, and neither of us would have backed down, and it would have been infuriating and very good. She folded the dress again. She didn't put it back in the wrapper. She put it on the hook beside her coat, where she could see it, where it could catch the morning light. The second chair appeared on a Friday in July. She came out to the porch in the early morning the way she always did. Coffee in both hands, coat not quite buttoned. The particular half-awake state of someone who was awake enough to function, but not yet awake enough to perform being awake. And stopped, because there was a second chair, beside the first one. Same height, same angle, facing east, where the light came first, where the land opened up past the near pasture, and the south fence and the long pale grass went all the way to the ridge. She stood there. She thought, oh, she thought. Don't make it into something it might not be, she thought, but look at it. Look at where it's facing. He built it facing east. He put it where the light comes first. He put it next to his chair. She thought, when did he build it? She thought, I heard wood being worked in the evenings. I heard the plane. I thought he was fixing something. She thought, he was making something. She thought, for me. She stood there, holding her coffee in both hands, and looking at the second chair and doing what she always did, which was think it through from every angle, and what she found from every angle was the same thing. He made a chair, he put it here. He didn't say a word about it. He just made it, put it here, and let it speak for itself. She sat down in it. The coffee was still warm. The east light was coming up over the ridge, slow and patient, the way it always did, not rushing, knowing it had all the time in the world. The grass caught the low angle and went gold. The cattle in the south pasture were beginning to move. She sat in the chair that had been made for her and looked at the land that the spring had begun to save, and she thought, "This is mine, not in the way of a deed, not in the way of a document filed at the county land office, in the way of the mark on the rock, in the way of, I came here. I knew this place. I stayed. This is mine." That evening, after supper, she was still on the porch. She had been there since the afternoon. She heard the screen door. Garrett came out. Didn't say anything. Just sat in his chair. The one that had been there before. The one that had been there alone. They sat. The light was going gold, and then orange, and then the color that doesn't have a name. The one between orange and the end of orange that only happens for about 4 minutes, and then it's gone. She said, "You built it facing east," he said. "It's where the light comes from," she said. "I know," he said. "You're here in the mornings." She said, "I know." He said, "Seemed like the right direction." She said, "It is. Silence. Not weighted, not complicated. Just the silence of two people who have said the things they needed to say and are now sitting with them." The grass moved. The cattle were settling for the night. Somewhere past the ridge, past the line of trees at the creek bed, the spring was running. She couldn't hear it from here, but she knew it was running. She would always know. She heard the screen door again. She heard something being dragged on wood. And then Cale Dunmore appeared around the edge of the porch, with a wooden crate he had clearly taken from the barn. He set it down at the edge of the top step. He sat on it. Nobody said anything. Nobody had invited him. He had not asked. He had just gotten a crate and come and sat down at the edge of things the way a man sits when he's not entirely sure he's welcome, but had decided to risk it. She looked at him. He looked at the grass. She looked at the grass. Garrett looked at the grass. 3 people. 3 different weights they were carrying. 3 different versions of what this land meant, and what it had cost them, and what it was beginning to give back. The small calf moved at the edge of the pasture. She saw it from here. Small against the bigger shapes of the herd. Always slightly apart. Always at the edge of things. Always, somehow, upright, she said. "There's the difficult one," Garrett said. "I see it," Cale said. "Been eating fine." "Gained weight since March, she said. "I know." "I checked," Cale's. "So did I." Garrett said nothing, but she heard the sound of him almost smiling, which by now she knew by heart. The stars came on. 1, then several, then more than you could count, the way they always did over this particular ridge, over this particular piece of ground, over the spring and the south pasture and the new grass, and the mark on the rock and the chair that faced east. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. She thought about the letter on the steps of the post office, the broken clasp on the sewing basket, the thumb holding it shut. She thought about the man at the creek sing and his flat question, and the 4 seconds of silence and Garrett driving on. She thought about the hollow note when the spade broke through to the water. She thought about the mark on the rock, her grandmother's hand, her own hand, Garrett's hand. She thought about Nochi Nochi. You sang off key and the horses loved you anyway. Your 4 children grew up knowing what it looked like when a man chose right, without calling it a choice. That is what you left. I put you down at the spring. Not forgotten, but put down I'm still here. This place is known. I came here. I stayed. The grass moved in the way it moves when there is no particular wind. Just the breathing of the country. Steady. Immense. Not caring about any of them specifically. Caring in the way that large things care. Without attention, without intention. Just by existing. just by being the kind of thing that was here before them and would be here after. But they were here now, all three of them, on a porch on a Friday night in July, with the spring running somewhere behind the ridge, and the second chair facing east, and the small, difficult calf standing at the edge of the pasture. Because that calf had decided on a cold January morning that standing was what it was going to do, and it had done it. And here they all were, and the stars were thick over the ridge, and nobody moved until it was completely dark. And then they stayed a little longer after that. There was a line in the ledger. At the bottom of the June entry, after the numbers, after the column headings, and the supply costs, and the head count and the partial bank payment, and the names of the LaFleur brothers, and the date the South pasture grass came back, in Kiona's handwriting, clear and exact. The way she wrote everything spring running, grass back. The frame was always good, and below that, in different ink, added later, the date smudged slightly, but somewhere between the end of summer and the beginning of fall. Garrett Aldous. Kiona Aldous, October, 1877. Water found. Land. The ledger stayed at the front of the shelf, not in a box, not in a drawer, front of the shelf, where anyone coming in from the field would see it. A record of what had been here, who had come, what had come through.